Honestly unbalanced.
I would love to know, to begin with, how you've opened up so much on social media, and was that a journey? Because I've stalked you a lot in the last like 48 hours, and sometimes I go quite heavily into people's past. Suddenly 7 years of scrolling has gone by.
Oh no, I don't even know what happened
Oh
7 years ago,
but
so I'm scared.
it seems like you've always been like super open. And was that something you were always comfortable with, or did it take work? And have you noticed benefits of being so open?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So I think, let's see, as far as being open, it's kind of yes and no. I like to express myself through writing. And so way before I had a following of any kind, just regular social media, even MySpace days, like early just on the internet, I'm always writing about my feelings. I just have to get it out of me. But I've always kind of had a disconnect that like people are reading it. It's more of just that act of getting it out. But the way that I've expressed myself and sharing my life has always been the same, whether I've had a really big audience or a really small audience. So, in that sense, it's felt natural. It doesn't always feel as natural speaking wise or in person. Hard conversations sometimes can still be challenging. People, they'll ask a lot, like, have you always been this vulnerable? Have you always been this open? And for me, it doesn't necessarily feel vulnerable to share in the way that I do because it almost feels kind of selfish. Like I said, it's like a cathartic thing. I'm just trying to get it out of me, but I have kind of a disconnect that, oh yeah, real people are actually going to read this. Or I might sit on a podcast and someone will say something back to me that I wrote or I said, and I'm like, oh gosh, I forgot that it's public.
It's weird to think how many people do read it. So you have over how many followers? You got over 200,000 followers.
Over 400,000. Yeah.
Sorry, I've halved
Yeah.
you. Over
Okay.
400,000 followers, and you just imagine that many people in front of you. Imagine 400,000 people.
Yeah.
That is multiple
Oh
arenas.
my gosh,
And
terrifying.
sitting on a sofa and talking about the things you do.
Just
imagine
reading.
just kind of just opening yourself to them. There is this weird detachment in the social media age. You forget like how many people are like seeing the inside of your toilet. If you take a photo or seeing your deepest thoughts. And so so how has that evolved for you? Like how have you used being so open as a way to connect with people? Was there a plan
Yeah,
behind that?
so just to kind of also finish answering your first question as far as benefits, there have definitely been benefits. I think just that feeling of connection and reminding people they might not be alone going through a hard thing. I get that same reminder back to me if I'm going through that hard thing. But there have also absolutely been downfalls too, and some severe boundaries being crossed and privacy and even like safety issues. So it has definitely changed over time. And even though I post a lot now, I actually share a lot less than what I used to. I kind of reserve the deeper, longer shares for my blog, which has a much smaller audience than my social media, for instance, or on something like a podcast where we can go more in depth. But I have had to kind of reassess different boundaries and how I share because yeah, it has some weird things have happened because of it, absolutely. But there has also been a lot of benefit to it. I've never done it from a sense of strategy of like, oh, if I share this, then that will get a lot of engagement or people will like that or more people will follow. It's always just been like something is feels like it's just coming out of me and I have to get it out. And as a result, things have grown, but it's not necessarily from that strategic place.
And a really big share for you was in 2020 when you officially came out on Instagram. So I'd love it if you could speak about that. Did you face adversity or were you welcomed with open arms? Like, how was that for you?
Yeah, so that was I faced a little bit of adversity, not a crazy amount, but I would say the most surprising was just the kind of the yoga people and the things that they said turned very spiritual, bypassy, like, oh, well, if your masculine and feminine energy was more balanced, then you wouldn't be having this issue and things like that. I had some people who were signed up for retreats. I came out before COVID, before the world shut down and retreats are still happening. So I had some people that were signed up for retreats with me that year that wanted to cancel because
No.
they didn't feel comfortable anymore.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
So there were some things like that. Overall, I would say, looking at the size of the audience and everything, overall, very positive experience. Of course, there's always going to be some bad seeds and some bad eggs in the bunch, but overall, pretty positive. And it kind of continues to be that way. I share my life and my wife the same amount that I would share when I was in relationships with men. So, it's sprinkled in there. I do still share little bits of my personal life, and especially in my stories, I'm sharing me and my dogs and her and that kind of thing. I notice that whenever I do post, like actually share a post with her, I will always lose at least 1,000 followers, maybe more.
No.
And so it's wild. Like it still happens. Sometimes people will still say, nasty internet commenty things, but overall, I would say the coming out experience was pretty seamless for me. And the way that I tried to approach it was just as if it was a non factor. And I just introduced her to my audience the same way that I introduced other partners to my audience that happened to be men. So I didn't want to be like, hey, I had this huge announcement. Guess what? I didn't make a big deal about it and just hoped that people would respond in the same way.
And how do you manage the difficult, the troll like comments? Because that's something that scares me about growing my social media. I think when you grow bigger, naturally you're going to attract more people that try to bring you down. And I just don't think I had the skin for it. I know it's not personal, it's their issues, but that still doesn't take away the fact that it would
Yeah.
deeply hurt me. So do you have tools to sort of protect yourself from that or to manage it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've only kind of recently sort of shifted here because I used to feel like, oh, I don't ever want to just delete and block people because it made it seem like I was hiding something. Like if I delete and block what they say, then people are going to think that what they said was true and I'm guilty. But recently I've started deleting and blocking because I'm just like, I don't want this. I don't need this. And this isn't true. And I have nothing to hide. And if people do think that what they're saying is true, then that's also on them. So that has kind of shifted for me over the years. But it's true. It's like, even if it is something that is ridiculous, it still hurts. It's still, and it does happen pretty infrequently. I would say, especially for the size of my account, you would think that the ratio would be higher. And I don't know if it's just probably from the content that I share and everything, but I don't get a lot of troll comments. The most that I get is usually homophobic about me and my wife or us trying for a baby and that kind of stuff.
It's I think it's completely natural to focus on the negative. Like we are programmed to do that because back in the day, if there was a lion stalking us on the plane or there was a fear of that, if we were wrong about it, we would die. But if we weren't wrong and there was just a noise and it was in the bushes and it like there is a big risk if it is. I'm not articulating this very well.
I think I get the
You
essence
get
of
the
what you're
idea.
saying. Yeah, we get
So
the idea.
if it's a bad thing, the bad thing
Yeah.
has bigger consequences than the good thing, is what I'm basically
It's
trying
like
to
a
say. So it's
protection
completely
thing.
natural that we emphasize the stuff that could do us harm because we want to protect ourselves from that. I found that Instagram tends to be nicer than other platforms. And I'm not on that many others. I haven't even begun with TikTok. But I do a little bit on YouTube.
Yeah.
And the only comments I've had have just been like completely abusive, like immediately. Like,
Really?
in quite a funny way.
Any other platform.
Just straight
Because
in
of
there.
that, I've heard that it's crazy, and TikTok I heard is like the worst.
It's
So
like-
I'm like, nope, not doing it.
Yeah,
No.
like, it's like I can't stand his voice. Who can listen to him for half an hour? And
People are so mean,
just,
aren't they?
oh, he looks like Magnus Carlsen. I didn't even know who Magnus Carlsen was, but apparently I really look like the chess player Magnus Carlsen.
I don't know.
But yeah,
Lol.
people get very heavy. But I agree with you. Like it's just worth on Instagram at least blocking, deleting. Like your account is a dictatorship. There is nothing of value by debating with people. There is nothing of value by promoting their views by leaving them there. Just delete them. Get rid.
I love what you said though about your quest really is to be you didn't say it exactly like this, but along the lines of to be your most authentic self in this world, like that wins over everything else. So how does one do the work to become their most authentic selves, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million dollar question. I
Yeah.
don't know if I have the answer for that, but I think, I mean, staying open and staying curious, I think are the biggest practices that I lean into. I really kind of try to shy away from anything that's too dogmatic, very black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking will always raise a red flag for me where it's like, is that the truth? Is that the only way? And I think for me, just maintaining that openness and curiosity has been, it's brought me closer to myself because it helps me to understand what I do believe in, what I do like, what I don't like, what my morals are, what my character is. So,
It's beautiful. And if we're to go back a little bit about how your yoga journey started, I know it's a really lovely story how you started it with your mum was the yoga teacher, and you just wanted to spend a bit more time with your mum. And like everyone, it was a physical practice for a good few years before things
mhm.
changed for you. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing about your near death experiences that kind of pushed you from the physical aspect of yoga into the more mental, emotional, spiritual
Yeah.
realms.
Yeah, so my mom started teaching me when I was 12 and it was very physically focused at the time and it's not like I want to be clear, I wasn't practicing when I was 12 like devoted 6 a.m. every day, little yogi child. It was not like that at all. It was kind of on and off. It was sporadic. Sometimes I would go, sometimes I wouldn't. And same throughout high school into college, I would also sometimes go, sometimes I wouldn't. I was never super dedicated. I've always liked moving my body and like physical exercise. So that was always my motive. And then when I left college, I started traveling by myself for the first time. And I went to school actually for teaching, but a classroom teacher didn't think I was going to be a yoga teacher. So after I graduated, I started teaching abroad and I first started in Ghana. And then 2 years later, I was in Kenya and Uganda and teaching English was full time. That's what my degree is in and what I was practicing at the time. And when I was in Uganda, I got bit by a tick that had African tick bite fever, which is like the African version of Lyme disease. And I got super, super sick. And I didn't know that that's what it was at the time. I just got really sick. The bite got really infected, similar to what happens with Lyme, where I got the crazy bullseye rash all over my body. And my arm where the tick bite was just swelling up. And I was in a pretty small village in Uganda. And they didn't really know what to do with me. They didn't really know much of how to treat anything other than malaria because that was really common there. And so they were treating me for malaria, even though I wasn't testing for it. And then they brought in a surgeon, which is a very loose term, but they brought in a surgeon to cut the bite out of my arm because they thought that that would help. And I was at the time, I was 24, pretty new to traveling on my own. I'd never had a really sick kind of experience like this abroad yet. So I also didn't know about advocating for myself and asking questions and all of these things I know now. And I was just kind of desperate to feel better. So they cut the bite out of my arm and then they didn't really properly clean it or anything. So it ended up, the infection got into my bloodstream. I went septic and this is brings me to the near death part where then I'm in an ambulance. They're rushing me to the capital, which is about 4 hours away. And I was in a lot of physical pain at this point, too, not only my arm, but just my whole body. I mean, I couldn't walk. I don't remember even a lot of this. This went on for like 48 hours, actually. And I was just kind of like in and out of consciousness. But what I really remember, because the drive to the hospital was 4 hours and we're in an ambulance, which was really actually more like the size of a hearse or something. Like it wasn't like a big ambulance that we would, so it was a tiny car. I was sharing it with someone else who also needed to go to the hospital. And I was there with the nurse and she was just kind of holding me on this metal table as I'm flying around. And they also had just redone the road, really beautiful paved road all the way to the capital, but it has a speed bump every quarter mile,
Oh
the
my
entire
gosh.
4 hour drive. So the ambulance is just flying and I'm just like constantly bumping up in my arm. Everything is in so much pain. And I was just really trying to count my breath and listen to my breath and feeling like, okay, as long as I'm breathing, I know that I'm alive, and was just really kind of, my breath sounded the same way it sounds when it's underwater. Like if you're snorkeling and you can hear your breath, how it's so rich and it's so loud and it's just kind of all consuming. And it was just that reminder, like, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive. And that is really kind of what brought me to yoga in a deeper sense of just really understanding breath as a life force, and brought me a lot closer to meditation as well. But just really understanding what breath is in yoga, which of course, is so much more than asana and so much more than the physical practice that I had been doing before. So that was the game changer for me.
Were there any kind of realizations or revelations you had over that time in terms of how you wanted to live your life going forward?
So actually, I almost said funnily enough, but it's really not funny. But right 6 months before that, I actually had another near-death experience. I was in an abusive relationship at the time that ended really explosively, and we got in a really bad physical altercation, and he almost killed me in that moment. And I had that same experience where it was like I left my body, I could see it from everything happening from up above, and had that kind of what you're talking about, like that reassessment of like what is important, what do I want, and was able to get myself out of that situation. It was this feeling of like, oh, this isn't a dream, this is my real life. And when you're having a nightmare and you want to scream, but you open your mouth and nothing comes out.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it felt like at first. And then I realized this is not a dream. You can scream. And so I just opened my mouth and started screaming bloody murder. And that is what saved me, because neighbors saw and called the cops and everything. But so that experience was really the one that kind of made me reassess, like, what do I want to do with my life? Who am I? I was also, again, still 24, so pretty young. It's kind of around that time where you might be questioning some of those things anyways. And that was one of the reasons why I did choose to leave and go back and teach and travel. And I was still figuring things out. I did not even come close to knowing, or I had a lot of healing to do, but I was kind of in denial of that. I just thought that travel would be like a really good band-aid for it, but it was a little bit of escapism too, it turns out. So yeah, that happened just 6 months before the tick experience happened. So it was kind of like the two together that just really, it was a big year. Let's just say that.
Oh my gosh, you've been through a lot. And at what point did
Yeah.
you decide to do your yoga teacher training?
Yeah, so it was about 2 years after that. I was abroad still for a while. I did come back to the States briefly because I had to be a part of the trial because he was arrested. The state of California was pressing charges against him, and I was subpoenaed as the main witness. So we were in a 9-month long court case for this that went to a jury trial. So I had to come back from my travels to be a part of that trial for 2 weeks, which was also horrible. And you can understand why people say, victims don't ever want to come forward, because that process re-traumatizes you all over again. He also ended up being found not guilty of everything. So then there was also that feeling of just like all of this was for nothing. And I ended up leaving again, and I started my first nonprofit, and I was away for 2 years, kind of until I ran out of money, and then came back to the States because I felt like this was the only place that I could come and work, and kind of came back against my will in a way. I really did not want to come back. And that was the time when I did my first yoga teacher training.
And what did your mom think of that? Did she know that was
My
always a
yoga
path for
teacher
you?
training?
Yeah.
No, 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 no. Even when I first did it, I was like, I'm not going to become a teacher. Like, I'm just doing it to deepen my practice, as people say. And I, at that point, have been practicing for over 20 years. So, or no, sorry, over 10 years. And so I was just like, yeah, this is kind of the next step. And I was really leaning into yoga at that time because I was still just going through a hard time and trying to assimilate. But she was like, really? Like, you're going to get your teacher training? I was like, no, 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 but I'm not going to teach. It's not like that. And this is just for me. And lo and behold, here we are.
But I think that's a perfect reason to do a teacher training, because
Yeah.
because you've been doing something for a while and you want deeper knowledge. I think that's perfect, rather than you want a career change or you want to change your life.
Mm-hmm.
That puts massive
Mm-hmm.
expectations on it. Just because you want to know more about yoga, I think is the perfect reason. I'm intrigued to know about how your mom persuaded you to do yoga at 12. Yeah, I was even speaking to someone today, a mother, about the relationship with actually their 12, 13-year-old daughter. and the hormones involved in that and alike. And
Oh
I
God,
think I
yeah.
think most mother-daughter relationships seem fairly volatile. Like, do you think that getting that yoga in early helped with that relationship, or were there still like lots of volatility?
Oh
Is
no, I
volatility a
was,
word?
I think so.
Volatility.
yeah, it is. So we'll say it is. I was a wild child too. Not necessarily child, but adolescent. So I had like a very strong rebellious phase, big partying, got very into drugs, all that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't say that the yoga helped with any of that. I was still me and my mom and my dad. I really resisted authority. But yeah, my mom, she has always been into fitness. So she was kind of like imagine Jane Fonda type
Love it.
workout, thong leotard,
Yes.
Reeboks. I grew up in the gym daycare, I knew that environment really well. So she actually never did, they didn't have 200-hour trainings back then. Yoga Alliance was not around, none of that was a thing. So she just self-studied. She learned about yoga and asked the gym where she was working if she could start teaching this thing called yoga. We also were from a pretty small town in Northern California. Like there was no yoga studios. There was nothing like that. Um, so yeah, I used to go to her classes at the gym, but they were also pretty physically focused, although it was primarily actually a lot older people. So it was more like restorative physical focus, not necessarily like high intensity vinyasa. And I was also a gymnast at the time. So I liked it because I was like, oh, I'm already flexible and I could do everything. So that makes me good. And I get attention from all the old people and they think I'm so good and cute. So I think I just liked that.
On that note of, because obviously there's lots of gymnasts and dancers that get into yoga
Mm.
and are told they're
Mhm.
good, depending on the teacher.
Yeah.
But often, especially 10 years ago, like everyone, oh my God, you're amazing. That's why they did it initially, because people said, oh my God, you're amazing at dance. You should do yoga as well. And there
Mhm.
is, of course, you talk about the evolution, the realization that there's no good at yoga. Good is in inverted comments and alike. But your style of teaching and your style of movement is clearly influenced, of course, by what you can do with the body, which is incredible from a gymnastics background, etc. When, like, how do you control? Let's say not control. Control is completely the wrong word. But when people come to you who are naturally very bendy, they're maybe 22, 23, they want
Mhm.
to do your training, and they are floppy, as it were, and they have
Oh
that
yeah.
movement but don't have that control. Like, how do you rein them in and persuade them actually they can still make the cool shapes and do those things that feel and look beautiful, but how do you make sure they make it harder for themselves? Like, what's your
Mhm.
persuading tactic?
Yeah, well, my classes, even if they are very bendy, they actually focus really heavily on strength still and mobility. So it is less of that. There's not really as much of an option for you to just kind of passively sit into something and have that banana back and just kind of hyperextend and be there. The way that I'll cue and everything is very to the strength and the integrity of the pose so that you are avoiding that, because I did that. And I know that it can look really cool, but it's not the best for you, especially over time. And it will challenge you more to call on strength if you are super bendy flexy. The same way that if you're super, super strong, then I will lean a little bit more into flexibility for that person. So it is individual for the person, but absolutely it can be, you know, I know that a lot of people get told that where, oh, if you're super flexible or if your body is able to make these certain shapes, and sometimes it's even just like the lines of the body. I have really long arms and legs, but I'm only 5'3". And so a lot of the times when people meet me in person, they're like, oh, I thought you were way taller because my photos, I look very limmy. It's actually just the shape that I can make. It doesn't mean that you're good at yoga. It definitely doesn't mean that you're a good teacher. And I think when I very first started teaching, that also added this a lot of pressure because I was just starting to share on Instagram from the yoga perspective. I was still had a personal size account and everything, but I could physically do a lot of things. I did not know how to teach them yet. And so I felt like, oh, if I'm going to be posting this stuff, I better know how to teach this really well too, because otherwise it doesn't align. People might come initially for the beautiful shape, the flashy pose, but they're going to stay for your ability to be able to teach it.
Mm.
So yeah, it's really important.
And it's interesting as well that for an external observer, especially someone newer to yoga, you can't tell the difference whether someone is actually hanging out or whether they're actually engaged. And like, we
Mm-hmm.
actually, our last guest was a former like 10-year prima ballerina, uh, and
Mm.
she was talking about how she went to some contortion schools, and the conditioning and the strength that a contortionist has is obscene. Whereas if you just
No,
look at it,
really.
you would look and think, oh, it's all just passive. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but it's so hard because you can't see what's happening in the body. You can't see internal
Mm-hmm.
engagement, can you?
Yeah. I think it too is a lot of like the entry into the pose. That is one thing that you can see if someone is just really like cranking their foot back behind them or yanking their torso towards their thighs. You can tell, like, okay, why don't you use some of your strength in some areas and actually draw it up? And then if it connects,
Mm.
go from there. So I do try to focus on a lot of entry and exit into the poses for that exact reason.
I wish I'd had that guidance that you just said on my initial training, because I was actually quite a new practitioner when I did my training, and I was actually forced. My lower back is not bendy at all, and I was sort of forced into, what's the one where you reach your arms behind and
What,
pull?
full dancers? No.
Yeah, yeah. She grabbed my foot and she was yanking it towards my hands, and I could feel my back going. But she was my teacher, and I was thinking, well, she obviously knows what she was
She
doing.
knows.
And then I was in pain the rest of the day, and I thought,
Mm.
but when you know, it's just not right.
But there's still lots of styles
Oh,
that are popular that teach like that, and you still see lots of
yeah.
assists where people are teachers who are strong are grabbing people's feet and pulling it to
What?
their
And you're
head.
saying that that's
No,
okay?
no, no. I'm just saying
Yeah,
there's still a lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
it,
yeah.
despite the increased awareness, and
Hmm.
there's still lots of students that go along with it,
Mm,
and this glorification of range.
yeah. Changing direction a little bit.
Hmm.
It was lovely to go onto your website actually and have a look through your about me section. I love the way you put it all together so creatively. And
Hmm.
one thing I loved, it wasn't just, I'm a yoga teacher and this is what I do. It's you call yourself an entrepreneur who knows how to monetize on her passions. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant, because teachers don't normally talk about that. And I think there's this kind of weird
Hmm.
belief in the yoga world that to make money isn't spiritual and you don't really talk about it, and you should almost like
Hmm.
give your time and energy away for free, which doesn't actually help anyone, because then you're giving from this place of lack, rather than having money and being able to live. So first of all, have you experienced, I guess, adversity from talking in that way? And secondly, I guess, what are your views on working to live a life that you love and to thrive and not just survive?
Yeah. Yeah, I love talking about this. I think it's so important for probably a lot of industries, but especially with yoga because of that spiritual element that you were talking about. And absolutely, I have received feedback that people don't always like it when I say, like, hey, it's okay to make money. It's okay to charge. You don't have to be donation based. You don't have to do a sliding scale. You also can do those things if you want to, but don't do it from a place of feeling guilty either.
Mm,
Don't do it because you feel like that's what you should do. And sustainably, energy wise, like you will not have enough energy if you were just living and working for free permanently. That doesn't make any sense. If you're doing it a one-off, if you're supporting a cause, all of these things, like sure, that's great. That's a nice thing to do. But if you don't have another job and if you don't have a partner who's supporting you, why should we be expected to just live and work for free? That
mm,
doesn't make any sense. And traditionally, yogis would be taken care of by their community and taken in and fed and repaid in those other ways where the community is supporting you. And obviously, modern yoga is very different than that. And we don't live that same way. So we have to be supported monetarily. So, yeah, I really like to encourage teachers to just kind of look at their relationship with money and what is that block? Are
mm.
you feeling shame? Are you feeling guilt? What is that block from allowing you to be okay with making money, particularly with this industry? And I think that the next really important thing is just making sure that if you do want to teach full time, like that is your only job, that is supporting you 100%, and you are going to be living in a developed country in particular where prices are not cheap, then you cannot only teach studio classes.
Mhm.
Like it's just not a sustainable way to support yourself forever. I think when you very first start teaching, it can be really helpful. Studio classes are great because you get a lot of different bodies. You really have to teach to the midline. You have to think on your feet a lot more. And there's just it really helps to define you as a teacher. But if you stay there forever, you will burn out because you have to teach a million classes a week to break even just to pay your bills, then you have no time for anything else, let alone planning a retreat or anything else that might make you more money. So you really have to try to diversify,
Mm.
I would say, within like maybe the first year of teaching.
And is that your experience? Is that sort of how you branched off into this way of thinking? Were you the teacher that taught and taught and taught and burnt out until you thought actually there must be another way, or have you always kind of been entrepreneurial mindset?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I wasn't planning on teaching from my training. So actually the reason that I started teaching was that I had started my nonprofit and I needed to raise money for my first project. So I don't have my nonprofit anymore, but I had it for almost 10 years. I did solar projects in off the grid communities. And at the time, you used to be able to pay to expedite your application to be a 501c3. In the states, at least, that's federally recognized, which means that if someone pays a donation to you, then it's a tax write-off. So that's really helpful if you're getting big corporate donations. And that was initially my plan, was to target larger solar companies and they would help to fund my projects. I was going to do like a very corporate structured business. And then at the turn of the year, they decided to change that law where you can't expedite the application. Everyone just has to wait in line. And the line was a year long. And I already had a project that was planned in April. So I had 4 months to come up with $40,000. And that sounded like $5 million for me at the time. Like that was so unattainable. And so I just had done my yoga teacher training a few months prior. And I thought, okay, well, I can just start teaching classes in the park. I'll do donation-based classes. Because it's for a charity, people tend to be more generous, and I'll kind of try to make like a little bit of an event out of it. So I reached out to sponsors so that we could do a raffle and people would buy raffle tickets, and co-taught it with another teacher who was a little bit more established in the community already. And we raised like $300. We did another one, we raised $400. So that's a lot for one yoga class,
Wow.
definitely more than you would normally get
Yeah.
for a donation class in the park. And I started thinking, like, what if a lot of teachers taught classes in their parks? And so this is, like I said, when I was kind of just starting to use Instagram for yoga, I still had a very personal sized account, probably 1,000 people or so, but I followed a lot of yoga people. I reached out to them. I was also living in Southern California at the time. And that was right when Aloe was starting and a lot of other yoga brands. So it was kind of just like right place, right time as well. And having that network there. And a lot of people said yes. So over the course of 2 weekends, we had several hundred teachers that were teaching classes in their communities. We ended up raising all of the money for the project, but that was really how I kind of even decided to start teaching. It was just like a means to an end in that moment. Really, my focus was more on the nonprofit side of things. And then I went, did the project in Ethiopia, came back, and I was like, okay, now I have to start all over because you still have to wait a year for that expedited or non-expedited process to happen. And that's then when I had the idea for a yoga retreat, because it was a lot to manage that many teachers all over the world, different time zones, like you guys were saying earlier, it can be tricky. And I love yoga teachers, but sometimes, we can be a little flaky and a little just hard to get a hold of. So I was like, I don't really want to just manage hundreds of teachers for the rest of my life. So what if I put together more of like an event that could raise just as much money over the course of one event or two events? And that's then when I got into teaching retreats. So very unusual kind of path into teaching. I started teaching retreats when I had less than a year of experience. And that's not something I recommend to people. Let me be clear. I don't necessarily think you should do that. I was just trying to make ends meet. And my focus was really on the projects and wanting to raise that money.
And there's no set way of being a teacher, is there? There's so many
Yeah.
variables, and yeah, most people shouldn't teach a retreat super soon. But I know lots of people that have already generated a massive social following due to their blogging or due to their fitness stuff, and they do a teacher training, not teach a retreat, and suddenly in a month it's sold out with 20 people, and they've literally just qualified.
Mhm.
And that's a beauty of being self-employed in this kind of industry, is that although it can be very limiting if you're not willing to kind of hustle a little bit and be inventive, if you are, it can take you in so many different places. Like our little baby's been in 9 countries already thanks to a career.
Oh,
And then who'd have thought that we'd end up like podcasting? All of these things were never part of the plan when I did a yoga
exactly.
teacher and podcasting or doing events or sound healing or trainings. I just assumed I'd be a hippie walking around East London with my long hair and my beads, just teaching 20 classes a week
Or
forever.
forever.
Yeah.
Did you?
I kind of thought that would be my life. Yeah. Just like a proper, I was very, very spiritual back then.
Are you happy it's turned out differently to that?
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah. No, I love it. Love how it turned out. And let's talk about how it turned out for you, because you're talking to us from Nicaragua. So you found love in Nicaragua, and you found a retreat center in Nicaragua. How did all that
Mhm.
happen?
Oh,
Yeah, so this is my wife and I actually met here at the end of 2019. Very unexpectedly, we both individually came here for surf trips. She had already been surfing for a little while. I had dabbled in it, but I really wanted to focus on learning how to surf. That was just something I wanted to just kind of prioritize play and joy, and I wanted to do that through surf. So came to Nicaragua. We both ended up in a shared dorm room, which we were neither of us were happy about. We're 31, 32 years old. Like, why am I in a shared dorm right now over New Year's? But it was the only place that was
Two bed?
available.
Was it a two-bed
And we
dorm,
were
or was there multiple
roommates.
bed dorm?
It
Just
was four.
four.
It was
Okay.
4 beds. Yeah. Yeah. So there were other people there who, and all of us became really good friends, her and I included. We had 5 days together. And then she left and went back to the States. She works in corporate America. She is an exec in finance, like very, very different world than me. And I was planning on staying in Nicaragua for about 6 weeks or so. I had a bit of a break between retreats at that time. And we stayed in touch. And I didn't really love the area where we met. So I decided to go somewhere else and came up to this area that we now live in. And I fell in love with it right away. And when I first met her, she was telling me that she eventually wanted to buy a little piece of land somewhere and eventually leave the corporate life. This was before COVID, before everyone was working remotely. So there wasn't as much that option back then. This is 2019, not that long ago, but it feels like an
yeah.
eternity. And I also wanted that same thing. I had been traveling for 10 years at that point and had been looking at different pieces of land. I put deposits on pieces of land in other countries, and it always fell through for one reason or another. So when I came up here and I saw this piece of land and just fell in love with it right away, and I asked her, this is a stranger essentially who I'd known for 5 days, if she wanted to buy the land with me.
Oh
And
my
she was like, no, that's really weird that you would ask me that.
God.
And so I was just like, no, you don't understand. Like, you have to come here, you have to see. I ended up convincing her to come back to Nicaragua just a few weeks later over MLK. She had a long weekend. So she was like, okay, I might be able to stretch a few extra days off. She comes back. She also had that same experience of like, wow, this place is so amazing. And in that time when she came back, so we had 10 days together that time, not 5, but 10,
She
which
stretched it
in
out.
lesbian years is like 10 years. Yeah. So we also fell in love during that time. And we actually signed the papers, and the way that our land is titled now, it's so divided down the center. We signed the papers as best friends. Never thought that this would happen, but we signed the papers, fell in love, and all of it happened kind of at once. So yeah, then we started building a year later and opened the following year after that.
Oh, what a beautiful story. I love a story.
And hang on, but then you opened in the middle of COVID then?
It was, so we opened, I always get confused because it was January 1st. So I think it was 2022. Yeah, 2022. So it was still not like middle of COVID, but we were building in the middle of COVID. And just try also right before COVID, Nicaragua had some protests and things that had become violent. And there was just like a tourism sort of shut down in the country right before COVID. And then COVID happened. It was like kicking Nicaragua while it was down tourism wise. So it was so hard just to convince people to come here at all. And then adding COVID on top of it, where people were still a little nervous about travel. But by that point, it was a lot more open. It was just more annoying with like getting the tests, and it has to be a certain kind of tests, and all of those regulations.
And what's been the experience owning a retreat center? Like I've always, or we've kind of dabbled with the idea of occasionally. Before we moved to where we are now, we did consider not going to another country, but moving to a more remote place in the UK. And then we just thought, actually, do we want to deal with yoga teachers on an admin front? Probably not. Do we?
Yeah.
Do we want to be away from people? And probably not. But yes, how has it been kind of owning a retreat center and spending a lot of time there and feeling it?
Yeah, I mean, so I was the same way where I was always, it sounded like a dream. And so I worked at a lot of retreat centers as a teacher for a long time, some of them from the ground up, like from construction until opening, just so I could really know, is this something that I want to do without investing my own money into figuring that out? So for anyone that is thinking like, oh, wow, that sounds like a dream, definitely work at a retreat center first. And there's a lot of opportunities, like some centers hire out two couples, families that you can fully run it for them for a year and kind of do whatever you want with it. So there are really good middle grounds of ways to figure out, ooh, do I want to do this without investing a lot of money and time and energy into this? Because it is a totally different job than just teaching yoga. And I think that's really important to reiterate to teachers who are interested in it. Same as teaching a retreat is a different job because you have that hospitality element, which is a 24/7 job. So it's a lot of work. It's super important. We have an incredible staff and team that work with us. So we are not like, we have a retreat here right now, but our manager is handling it. So we're not even we can kind of pick and choose how frontward facing we want to be with it. But if you are someone that is either on a smaller budget or you aren't able to have a big staff, then just make sure that you have a lot of energy because it takes a lot. It's a lot of work.
Is there anything that you would tell yourself, your former self, in 2019 about something you should or shouldn't do in the journey of opening a retreat center? Any advice to your 2019
I mean, we
self?
could have a whole separate podcast about this. Yes. I would absolutely hire a different contractor, a different architect to start. I mean, there's just some functionality things here that were a nightmare. Because we're on totally raw land. We did not have electricity, water, Wi-Fi, nothing. We're oceanfront, so you get that beating from all the salt water. And so there's just some things functionality wise that our designer, for instance, he's like, but it's pretty. And you're like, yeah, but it just got eaten away by the salt water, or like it completely collapses in the wet season. So yeah, we didn't know anything about construction, about anything. It was really the blind leading the blind. And we trusted some people that we thought knew, like architects and contractors, that were not the most reliable, and then had to step in and figure all of that stuff out in a second language that I was also learning at the time. I didn't know any Spanish. So it was a huge, huge learning curve, but we did it. We look around sometimes and we're like, isn't it crazy that this happened? We actually pulled it off. It's a miracle.
What's the name of it if people want to find it? Your retreat center.
Still Salty.
Oh yes, of course.
Still Salty.
That's such a good name.
And then that's .com.
Yeah, Still Salty Escape is the full name, but most people know it as Still Salty.
And as a last question, I mean, you've just got this amazing infectious passion and drive for life, and you're doing such amazing things. And you say on your website, you've chosen to create a life that you don't need to run away from, where you can, work under a coconut tree. Have you always sort of had that vision in your heart, or was there a point where you just thought, right, I'm actually just going to decide to have it all now?
Yeah, I don't know why, but that has always been in me. I had an office job once. I worked at a nonprofit, and it was an amazing experience. I've been in the nonprofit world for a long time, but the thought of just being in an office day in and day out, it was like my soul was just withering away. And this was also, it was work that I enjoyed doing. It was important work, and I loved the company that I worked for, but I just couldn't do it. And even back then, before there was many opportunities on the internet to be able to be more entrepreneurial, with all the ways we have now, like you said, podcasting and blogging and all of those things, Instagram, they were around, but not in the same way. But I was just sort of always like, I would rather make less money and be really happy and feel free and be able to travel than kind of sacrifice my soul is what it felt like. And so I just kind of scrapped it around and made it work. But I had a lot of odd jobs in the meantime. I was a nanny a lot. I bartended, so I did a lot of things that were outside of my field. I didn't need a specific education for, because I made really good money doing them. And I wanted to make good money so that I could travel as much as I possibly could.
Inspiring.
Okay. And what do you want people to know about you, or where to find you, or how to interact with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram. I don't really use many other platforms. My handle is Kayla Nielsen. My website is there too. So I have a blog. I post a new blog every single day. Yoga, wellness, travel, all different kinds of content. Same kind of stuff that you find on my Instagram, but just more elaborated, more educational. And yeah, you can reach out to me there. You can connect with me there. I have some retreats, but they are full. You can join the wait list if you want to, or you can come visit us in Nicaragua.
Amazing.
Oh God, I wish I talked about how you managed to do one blog a day. That's incredible. But
Next
that's
time.
for another
Next
time.
time.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
joining
much,
us.
Kayla.
Honestly unbalanced.